Silence, psychology, and the human mind. Life behind bars. Silence as a designed environment. At ADX Florence, silence is not incidental. It is deliberate. Every element of the facility is engineered to reduce sound, movement, and human interaction. Thick concrete walls absorb noise. Solid steel doors block conversation. Inmates are separated not just physically but acoustically. The result is an environment where silence becomes the dominant presence. This design was not accidental. Federal prison planners believed that by eliminating communication and unpredictability, violence could be reduced to near zero. Control in this model is achieved not through constant confrontation but through absence. Yet silence does more than suppress behavior. It reshapes perception. Isolation as daily reality. Life inside ADX Florence is defined by extreme isolation. Most inmates are confined alone in their cells for approximately 22 to 23 hours each day. Meals arrive through a slot in the door. Movement outside the cell is rare, scheduled, and tightly controlled. When it occurs, inmates are typically restrained and escorted without verbal interaction. Recreation, when permitted, takes place in small concrete enclosures open to the sky but enclosed on all sides. These spaces prevent contact with other inmates and offer minimal sensory variation. While the conditions are described administratively rather than punitively, the lived experience is one of long-term separation from human society. When isolation becomes prolonged. Short-term isolation has long been used in prisons as a management tool. What distinguishes ADX Florence's duration? In this facility, isolation is not measured in days or weeks, but in years. Some inmates spend a decade or more under near total social separation. Over time, the human brain responds to this absence of interaction in measurable ways. Psychological research consistently shows that prolonged isolation increases the risk of anxiety, depression, sleep disruption, and difficulty concentrating. In some cases, individuals experience perceptual distortions or heightened emotional reactivity. These effects do not appear in every individual, but the probability increases with time. Duration, not just severity, becomes the defining factor. Sensory deprivation in the brain. Isolation at ADX Florence is reinforced by sensory restriction. Cells offer little visual stimulation. The window is intentionally narrow, preventing a meaningful view of the outside world. Sounds are muted. Smells are neutralized by controlled ventilation systems. Days are highly uniform with few changes in routine or environment. Psychologists describe this condition as sensory deprivation. When the brain receives limited external input over long periods, it may begin to amplify internal stimuli. Thoughts loop. Emotions intensify or flatten. Minor sensations can feel overwhelming. While prison officials do not define ADX Florence as a sensory deprivation environment, mental health experts argue that the functional effects closely resemble those documented in deprivation research. Time distortion and cognitive strain. One of the most commonly reported effects of long-term isolation is distortion of time. Without social interaction, variation, or external reference points, days begin to blur together. Weeks lose definition. Months pass without clear markers. Cognitive scientists note that memory and perception rely heavily on novelty and interaction to structure time. Inmates housed in extreme isolation have described difficulty maintaining focus, reading for extended periods, or organizing complex thoughts. These effects are not universal, but they appear frequently enough to be documented in clinical evaluations and court testimony. The mind, deprived of stimulation, begins to conserve energy by narrowing its focus. Pre-existing mental illness. A critical aspect of the psychological debate surrounding ADX Florence involves inmates with diagnosed mental illnesses. Court records confirm that individuals suffering from serious conditions, including schizophrenia, major depressive disorder, bipolar disorder, and post-traumatic stress disorder, have been housed in the facility. Some arrived with diagnoses already in place. Others developed symptoms while incarcerated elsewhere and were transferred following behavioral incidents. Federal authorities state that mental health services are provided, including psychiatric evaluations, medication management, and crisis intervention when necessary. These services exist within the same restrictive environment as the rest of the facility. Critics argue that meaningful treatment is difficult to deliver under conditions of extreme isolation, where therapeutic relationships are limited and social reinforcement is absent. This disagreement remains central to legal and ethical debates surrounding the prison. Adaptation versus deterioration. Not every individual responds to isolation in the same way. Some inmates develop strict personal routines to impose structure on an otherwise unchanging environment. Exercise schedules, reading regimens, repetitive movements, and rigid daily plans become tools for maintaining psychological stability. Mental health professionals often interpret these behaviors as adaptive responses, efforts to preserve control, agency, and cognitive engagement. However, when routines become compulsive or inflexible, they may also signal strain. Distinguishing adaptation from deterioration is difficult, especially in a setting where observation is limited and privacy is high. Emotional blunting and hyperreactivity. Extended isolation can lead to two seemingly opposite emotional outcomes. Some individuals experience emotional blunting, a sense of numbness or detachment from both positive and negative feelings. Others develop heightened irritability, anxiety, or anger, sometimes triggered by minor disruptions. Psychologists explain that regular social interaction plays a critical role in emotional regulation. When that interaction is removed, emotional systems may either shut down or become unstable. Correctional officials acknowledge behavioral changes but often attribute them to individual traits rather than confinement conditions alone. The reality is complex, and causation is difficult to establish definitively. Suicide risk and self-harm concerns. Across correctional systems, inmates held in segregated housing show higher rates of self-harm compared to the general prison population. This association has made suicide prevention a central concern in facilities like ADX Florence. Monitoring protocols, evaluations, and intervention procedures are in place, though details of specific incidents are rarely public. What is clear is that isolation and psychological vulnerability intersect in ways that demand constant attention. Whether isolation itself is the primary driver, or whether it amplifies existing risk, remains a subject of ongoing debate. The limits of what is known. Much of the psychological reality of ADX Florence remains inaccessible. Clinical records are confidential. Internal assessments are often sealed. Long-term outcome data tracking inmates after years of isolation is limited. Former inmates have described profound psychological effects, but accounts vary and cannot always be independently verified. This lack of transparency complicates oversight. It also ensures that debates surrounding ADX Florence continue without definitive resolution. Silence as policy. Silence at ADX Florence is not a side effect. It is policy. The facility operates on the assumption that removing communication removes threat. Whether that assumption holds over the long term, psychologically or institutionally, remains unresolved. What is beyond dispute is that ADX Florence represents the most extreme use of isolation in the U.S. federal prison system. Its psychological consequences are not hypothetical. They are real, documented, and still being contested. Isolation and the sense of self. Extended isolation affects more than mood or behavior. It can alter how individuals perceive themselves. Psychologists have long noted that identity is reinforced through interaction, being seen, heard, challenged, and acknowledged by others. In environments where those interactions are absent, the internal sense of self can weaken. Thoughts may become repetitive. Language can lose nuance. Emotional responses may flatten or intensify without clear cause. Within highly restrictive confinement, some individuals report difficulty articulating who they are outside of routine and control. This phenomenon is not universal, but it appears frequently enough in clinical observations to be recognized as a potential consequence of long-term isolation. Language, thought, and social atrophy. Human language is inherently social. Without regular conversation, verbal skills can erode. Clinical evaluations submitted in federal cases have documented reduced verbal fluency among some isolated inmates, difficulty finding words, forming complex sentences, or sustaining coherent narratives. Reading and writing remain possible, but spoken interaction is limited to brief, procedural exchanges. Written communication cannot fully substitute for speech. Conversation involves rhythm, emotion, and immediate feedback, elements largely absent in extreme isolation. Over time, this absence may contribute to cognitive strain and reduced expressive capacity. Predictability as control. Predictability defines daily life in high-security isolation. Schedules rarely change. Meals arrive at the same times. Movement follows strict protocols. Environmental variation is minimal. From an institutional perspective, predictability reduces conflict and uncertainty. From a psychological perspective, it removes novelty. Routine can stabilize. But when routine becomes absolute uniformity, it may also suppress engagement. Without variation, the mind has fewer opportunities to orient itself, adapt, or recover from stress. The balance between order and stimulation becomes difficult to maintain. Controlled human presence. Human presence inside extreme isolation is functional rather than social. Interactions are brief and task-focused. Meals are delivered. Restraints are applied. Doors are opened and closed. Conversations, when they occur, are limited to instructions or responses. Eye contact is often minimal or non-existent. This transforms interaction into signal rather than relationship. Over time, human contact may come to represent control rather than connection, reinforcing emotional detachment. Psychological evaluation under restriction. Mental health evaluations within extreme security environments operate under significant constraints. Clinicians rely on scheduled assessments, observation, and records review. Opportunities for extended therapeutic engagement are limited by security protocols. The environment itself shapes what can be observed and how. Courts reviewing these evaluations have noted the difficulty of delivering comprehensive mental health care under such conditions, while also recognizing the security context in which they occur. The result is an ongoing tension between clinical ideals and institutional limits. The question of duration. Duration changes everything. Short-term isolation may produce stress responses that subside with time. Long-term isolation compounds effects. Psychological strain accumulates. Coping mechanisms may harden into rigid patterns. Recovery becomes more complex the longer isolation persists. This is why debates surrounding extreme confinement often focus less on whether isolation is used and more on how long it lasts. Transition within the system. Programs designed to reduce restrictions over time exist, intended to allow gradual movement toward less isolated environments. Progress is based on behavior, compliance, and ongoing assessment. Critics argue that the psychological effects of prolonged isolation can make successful transition difficult. Supporters argue that gradual reintegration incentivizes stability and accountability. Clear conclusions are difficult to draw without comprehensive long-term outcome data. Oversight without visibility. Oversight mechanisms exist through courts, inspections, and administrative review. Yet daily psychological experience inside extreme isolation remains largely unseen. Most assessments rely on documentation rather than observation. This distance fuels ongoing debate about transparency, accountability, and the limits of public understanding. Silence as an enduring condition. Silence in extreme confinement is not temporary. It endures. It shapes perception, behavior, memory, and emotion over time. Whether it succeeds as a security strategy or exacts a psychological cost that outweighs its benefits, remains unresolved. What is certain is that silence, once imposed for years, does not simply disappear when doors open. Isolation and memory formation. Memory relies on variation. Psychological research shows that the brain encodes memories by detecting change, new environments, new interactions, new emotional cues. In extreme isolation, where days are nearly identical, memory formation can weaken. Inmates housed for long periods under highly uniform conditions have reported difficulty recalling sequences of time. Days collapse into each other. Events lose order. Some individuals describe entire months as indistinguishable blocks rather than discrete experiences. This does not indicate memory loss in a clinical sense. Instead, it reflects an absence of anchors. Without variation, the brain has less material to store. Attention, focus, and cognitive narrowing. Extended isolation can lead to what psychologists describe as cognitive narrowing. Attention becomes fixed on limited stimuli, small sounds, bodily sensations, repetitive thoughts. Tasks that require sustained focus, such as reading complex material, may become more difficult over time. Conversely, minor disruptions can feel overwhelming. This narrowing is often interpreted as an adaptive response. With fewer external demands, the mind conserves energy by reducing its range of engagement. Over long periods, however, this adaptation can make reintegration into more complex environments challenging. Sleep disruption and circadian drift. Sleep patterns in extreme isolation are frequently disrupted. Although cells have lighting schedules, the absence of natural cues, social interaction, varied activity, changing environments, can interfere with circadian rhythm regulation. Some inmates experience fragmented sleep, excessive sleeping, or difficulty distinguishing night from day. Sleep disruption compounds other psychological stressors. Reduced sleep quality is associated with impaired concentration, emotional instability, and increased vulnerability to anxiety and depression. stress physiology and prolonged confinement. Chronic isolation activates the body's stress response. Psychologists and medical researchers note that prolonged stress can elevate cortisol levels, affect cardiovascular health, and weaken emotional regulation. In high-security confinement, stress is not acute and episodic, it is sustained. While not all individuals show the same physiological responses, prolonged activation of stress systems is a recognized risk factor for both mental and physical health decline. Anger turned inward. In environments where outward expression is restricted, anger often has nowhere to go. Some individuals suppress it, leading to emotional flattening. Others internalize it, resulting in rumination, self-blame, or despair. Without social outlets, conflict resolution mechanisms disappear. This dynamic helps explain why isolation is often associated not only with aggression, but also with withdrawal and self-directed harm. Why effects differ between individuals. Not everyone experiences isolation the same way. Individual history matters. Prior trauma, mental health status, coping skills, and length of confinement all shape outcomes. Some individuals remain psychologically stable for extended periods. Others deteriorate rapidly. This variability is often cited by correctional authorities as evidence that isolation is not inherently damaging. Mental health experts respond that variability does not negate risk, it complicates prediction. Both positions can be true simultaneously. Psychological effects beyond confinement. One of the least studied aspects of extreme isolation is what happens afterward. Formerly isolated individuals may struggle with overstimulation, social interaction, decision-making, or emotional regulation when moved into less restrictive environments. These difficulties are not universal, but they are documented frequently enough to raise concern. Long-term isolation does not end psychologically when confinement ends. Why definitive answers remain elusive? Despite decades of debate, definitive conclusions remain elusive. Controlled long-term studies are rare. Ethical limitations restrict experimentation. Data access is limited. Many evaluations rely on retrospective accounts rather than longitudinal tracking. As a result, policy decisions often proceed without full clarity, guided by risk management rather than certainty. What silence ultimately does. Silence, when imposed briefly, can calm a space. When imposed for years, it becomes something else entirely. Inside the most restrictive confinement environments, silence reshapes how people think, feel, remember, and relate to the world. It does not act suddenly. It accumulates. Its effects emerge slowly, unevenly, and often invisibly. Some individuals endure it with structure and discipline. Others deteriorate. Many exist somewhere in between, functioning but altered. What makes this environment uniquely difficult to assess is not just what happens inside it, but what cannot be easily measured. Psychological change does not always announce itself. It settles quietly, often long before it becomes visible. Correctional systems rely on silence to maintain control. Courts rely on legal thresholds to define harm. Science relies on incomplete data to estimate risk. None provide a final answer. What remains is a prison built on the assumption that the absence of interaction equals safety, and the unresolved question of what that absence ultimately costs. This is not a story of speculation. It is a record of documented conditions, documented effects, and documented uncertainty. And in that uncertainty, silence continues. Isolation and moral reasoning. Extended isolation does not only affect emotion and memory, it can also influence moral reasoning. Psychologists studying long-term confinement have noted that when individuals are removed from social environments, opportunities to negotiate norms, resolve conflict, or test ethical boundaries disappear. Moral judgment becomes internal rather than social. Over time, right and wrong may be evaluated less through shared standards and more through personal survival logic. This does not inherently lead to violence, but it can weaken empathy and reduce sensitivity to the impact of one's actions on others. In extreme isolation, moral frameworks risk becoming abstract, detached from lived social consequence. The collapse of social calibration. Human behavior is calibrated socially. Tone of voice, facial expression, posture, and reaction all serve as feedback mechanisms. In isolation, these cues vanish. Without them, emotional responses may drift out of proportion, either muted or intensified. When inmates later encounter others, even minimal interaction can feel overwhelming. Normal disagreement may register as threat. Neutral expressions may be misinterpreted. This loss of calibration is one reason why reintegration, even into controlled environments, can be destabilizing after prolonged isolation. Control over the body. Extreme confinement reshapes the relationship between the individual and their body. Movement is restricted. Posture is regulated. Even basic physical autonomy, when to walk, when to eat, when to lie down, is externally controlled. Psychologists note that when bodily agency is reduced for long periods, individuals may experience detachment from physical sensation or, conversely, heightened fixation on bodily states such as pain, tension, or discomfort. This can contribute to dissociation or somatic anxiety, where psychological stress expresses itself physically. Repetition and mental looping. Repetition dominates life in extreme isolation. The same walls, the same sounds, the same schedule. Without interruption, thought patterns can loop. Concerns replay without resolution. Regrets resurface repeatedly. Minor anxieties grow larger in the absence of distraction. Psychologists describe this as cognitive looping, a state where the mind, lacking external input, turns inward and repeats itself. Over time, this can intensify distress and reduce problem-solving capacity. Power, compliance, and internalization. In highly controlled environments, power is constant and visible. Rules govern every movement. Surveillance is omnipresent. Compliance becomes not just a requirement but a survival strategy. Over time, some individuals internalize control. Decisions are deferred. Initiative diminishes. When authority structures dictate every outcome, self-directed behavior may atrophy. This is not a failure of character. It is a predictable response to environments where autonomy carries risk. Resistance without action. Resistance in isolation rarely looks like rebellion. With few avenues for action, resistance often becomes internal. Refusal to engage emotionally. Withdrawal. Silence within silence. Some individuals preserve identity through internal narratives, memories, beliefs, or imagined futures. Others disengage entirely. Both responses reflect attempts to reclaim control in an environment where outward resistance is impossible. Psychological fatigue. Psychological fatigue accumulates quietly. It is not always dramatic. There may be no breakdown, no visible crisis. Instead, there is erosion of motivation, curiosity, emotional range. This fatigue can make even small decisions feel burdensome. Over time, the effort required simply to endure may consume all available mental energy. Why measurement fails? One of the greatest challenges in evaluating extreme isolation is that its effects are often subtle, delayed, and deeply personal. Standard psychological metrics struggle to capture loss of identity, erosion of empathy, or cognitive narrowing. By the time symptoms are measurable, they may already be entrenched. This makes policy evaluation reactive rather than preventative. Isolation as a long-term variable. Isolation does not act as a single event. It functions as a variable applied over time. The longer it lasts, the more it interacts with personality, history, and mental health. Outcomes diverge. Predictability decreases. This variability is often cited to justify the practice. Yet it is also what makes the risks difficult to dismiss. The weight of permanence. Perhaps the most psychologically significant factor is not isolation itself, but uncertainty about its end. When confinement has no clear timeline, the mind cannot orient toward relief. Hope becomes abstract. Motivation weakens. Permanence, or even the perception of it, alters how individuals endure stress. What might be tolerable temporarily becomes destabilizing when indefinite. What this environment ultimately tests. Extreme isolation tests more than security policy. It tests the limits of human adaptability. It tests assumptions about control and safety. It tests how much psychological cost a system is willing to absorb in pursuit of order. And it does so quietly, away from public view, one day at a time. ADX Florence was built to answer a single question. How far can control be pushed in the name of security? What exists inside its walls is not rumor or myth, but a system, engineered, regulated, and defended, whose psychological consequences are still being examined and still not fully understood. Silence here is not accidental. It is policy. And once imposed, it does not simply end when the doors open. Thanks for watching Life Behind Bars.